This section is going to be looking at the early period in French rule in Algeria from 1830 to about 1848. But before we begin, I want to kind of speak to what we should be looking at more um, conceptually. Uh, the cases that I picked for this year: Indian independence, Algerian independence, the American Civil Rights Movement, apartheid South Africa. These are cases, and then next year, Mexico. Um, these are cases where there's a lot of shared issues across these different places, but there's also particularities that are unique to each of these countries. Your task this year and going into next year, first semester next year, when you look at 20th century Mexico, is to look at these big ideas by seeking similarities and differences, grounded in specifics. So, yeah, you'll see patterns, but they're not going to be exactly the same. Some patterns that you'll see, some issues or topics that you'll see again and again and again are colonialism, in the Mexican case, neocolonialism, nationalism, war, the contest between capitalism and socialism, economic and legal apartheid, which is known in this country as segregation, land dispossession, that is to say, the taking of land from one group and giving it to another, greed, and differing ideals. So, again, all of those again: colonialism, nationalism, war, socialism and capitalism, legal and economic apartheid or segregation, land dispossession or land theft, greed, and differing ideals are issues that you'll see again and again and again across this year and into next. And they are similar but not the same. So let's turn to the Algerian case. What we're going to be looking at over a series of lectures is the rise of Algerian nationalism, starting with the French invasion in 1830 to the end of World War II and Sétif in 1945. So we can disaggregate this period into a few time periods. What's sometimes known as the popular resistance is from 1830 to 1919. And you have the early period, which is French military rule, and the later period being civilian colonial rule. Then from World War I until 1954, you have a nationalist period where Algerian leaders are calling for independence. And then there is a bloody and protracted war of independence from 54 to 62. So from the video, from the Great Courses video, and from the reading by Eugene Rogan, you learned about the fly whisk incident as a spark, if you will, for the French invasion. But maybe, but probably not. So the incident happens in 1827, but the invasion happens 3 years later in 1830. And really, what this has more to do with than anything is this fellow here at right, Charles X. Charles X was a king of France during the Bourbon, what was called the Bourbon Restoration, this 15-year period where European allies back the French royalty, put the French royalty back in power after the French Revolution. And so this is kind of like the king put back in power. He's not the individual king, but he is part of that lineage. He's a reactionary that wanted to keep down the feelings of the French Revolution. And he's not totally successful with that. Across the 1920s, there's this growing popular opposition to the royalty and his policy ideals. So there's this upcoming election in 1830, and there's this upcoming parliamentary election, and he wants his people to win, and basically he wants a military victory to generate popular support. So he takes this fly whisk incident that's frankly a minor event and manufactures it as a reason to go to war. So this is an idea of war as a distraction for domestic troubles. There was a movie that came out in the late 1990s called Wag the Dog, a comedy, a film where a um, president who's in trouble with a love affair um, basically manufactures, with Hollywood's help, an imaginary war. It doesn't really exist. Um, so, quick strike, easy victory, distraction, rally around the flag. It's not just this Hollywood case of Wag the Dog, but there were real life cases in our own country's history, recent history, of heads of state having a desire for a quick military victory to improve their domestic standing. So President Reagan invades Grenada in 1983 with this idea. Bill Clinton um, gets in trouble with the whole Monica Lewinsky story of, well, you can look that up, in 1998. And he puts forward a story that there is a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan that is manufacturing, I think it was nerve agents that would be used as in acts of terror, right? This is pre 9/11. So they blow it up, but there's never any proof that it was doing anything untoward. And it was exactly 1 week after the Monica Lewinsky story broke. So obviously, an attempt to get the Lewinsky stuff off the headlines. You could argue that Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003 was similarly similar in nature. So really, the invasion of Iraq, or invasion of Algeria, has way more to do with this guy here at right than anything going on in Algeria itself. Nonetheless, they do invade. I think the reading and the Great Courses lecture does a very good job on the military side, so we're not going to really talk about it here. But let's just talk about French visions for Algeria. France saw Algeria as an opportunity to have a settler colony. Britain had settler colonies, it had the United States and Canada and Australia, and France wanted theirs. So this informed a lot of their 19th century, 1800s actions. The intent was always for it to be a settler colony. So the goal was to replace an indigenous population with settlers, to expropriate land, that's to say, take their land and distribute this land to settlers. So we're going to go, French are saying to themselves, we're going to go to Algeria, we're going to defeat Algerian forces, initially run by an outpost of the Ottoman Empire. And then we're going to take the best land that's along the north coast, along the Mediterranean, drive them out, and give away the land to French people. Now, this is not unlike our local history. In 1850, the Oregon Donation Land Law, sometimes called the Land Act, basically gave stolen indigenous land to white men and white women for free. Prior to it, from 1843 to 1850, it was 320 acres of land for men, and then another 320 acres if they were married. After it, it was 320 total. But this is most of the land that's west of the Cascades here in the Willamette Valley was redistributed through the Oregon Donation Land Law. And so this leads in Oregon's case to a fivefold increase in white population in Oregon just in one decade, just from 1850 to 1860, fivefold increase. So giving away land is a great way of getting people there, and the same thing we'll see in the Algerian case. Just a brief number to share with you in the Oregon case, 7,000 individuals white individuals made claims to 2.5 million acres of land in Oregon. So that's something. We'll continue to look at land expropriation when we get to our study of another settler colony of South Africa, and then also next year, first semester, when you look at Mexico under Porfirio Diaz. In the Mexican case, a lot of Mexican land is owned by hacendados, as they were called, these haciendas or plantations. And an incredible amount of Mexico was owned by Americans who were not in Mexico at all, but they owned it, and So Mexican land was very, very small percentage of Mexican land under Diaz in the late 19th, early 20th century was owned by indigenous Mexicans. Okay, let's get back to Algeria here. Unlike the dynamics of indigenous genocide in the United States and Canada, Algeria is more like South Africa, where the indigenous population remains in the majority throughout French rule, but the French wanted to eliminate the local population. And so, again, to be clear, the French remain in the minority the entire time, but the goal, and you can see this in French law in Algeria, the goal was to eliminate the local population. Um, Further speaking about French political leadership, yes, there are what we would call in this country radical Republicans of the Civil War who were opposed to colonialism, but they are very, 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 very rare. French leadership from this period, 1830 to 1870, across the political spectrum, are on board with colonialism. They're all on board with colonialism, but the difference manifests themselves in what they thought colonial Algeria should look like. So it's kind of like this tabula rasa, a blank slate, where French idealists could see it as an opportunity to create an ideal society. For example, the socialist saw French socialists saw it as an opportunity to create this utopian socialist society in settler Algeria. And again, we can make a connection to Oregon history, Oregon early history. White leadership, political leadership in Oregon, in the Oregon Territory, saw Oregon as a white utopia. So Oregon, as some of you may know, in our Constitution, we're the only state to have entered the Constitution with exclusion laws, racial exclusion laws, entered the United States with racial exclusion laws. So we banned slavery, but the state of Oregon also banned black people with the idea of creating this white utopia, this ideal space away from the troubles of the 1850s America. And there were French equivalents. Hey, let's create a society anew, like a planned city, but in this case, it's a planned country. Okay, to restate, the goal here is to replace the indigenous population with settlers, to take their land, what's called expropriate, to take their land and distribute it to the land of settlers. Abdul Qadir, I wanted to just show you a picture because I don't think you had an opportunity to see it in the reading. Eugene Rogan writes very nicely about him in that first reading, and there's a discussion about him in the Great Courses lecture, so I'm not going to speak to him here, but he's clearly a very fascinating man. All right. Our next lecture will be looking at the Mokhrani Uprising in 1871.